Lincoln believed that upholding the federal Constitution, even with its slavery provisions, was the safest way to promote the demise of slavery in the long run. For example, in March of 1860, Lincoln said, "If then we of the Republican Party who think slavery is a wrong and would mold public opinion to the fact that it is wrong should get the control of the general government, I do not say we would or should meddle with it where it exists. But we could inaugurate a policy which would treat it as a wrong and prevent its extension." Moreover, Lincoln's respect for the federal Constitution entailed a commitment to restrict the extension of slavery because the Constitution stood for the equality of men. He considered this what he called the philosophical cause of the birth of the American nation and its subsequent prosperity. Lincoln wrote in a fragment that we have to himself, "The assertion of that principle, liberty to all, at that time was the word fitly spoken, which has proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture, or frame, or setting of silver, subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture." Thus, Lincoln believed that to not restrict the spread of slavery would subvert the first principle of free government. Lincoln also went so far as to exclaim the following. He said, "Come to the rescue of this great principle of equality. Don't interfere with anything in the Constitution. That must be maintained, for it is the only safeguard of our liberties." To uphold the Constitution in his mind was to uphold the free principles that gave it legitimacy and to strengthen the means of ultimately securing freedom for all. Lincoln always believed that the will of the people as expressed through constitutional government was the only legitimate form of rule. As he put it in his first inaugural address, a majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. However, he also believed that the will of God prevails, as he put it, and that in some way the Almighty worked out his purposes through what he called human instrumentalities. So how was emancipation connected to Lincoln's view of the will of God as expressed in the politics of free human beings? Lincoln held firmly to both horns of the dilemma between man's free will and God's superintendence of human affairs. And so we have, for example, Lincoln's longtime law partner, William Herndon, commenting that Lincoln held most firmly to the doctrine of fatalism all his life, while observing that Lincoln was always calculating, always planning ahead. As we know, famous statement, his ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. Lincoln's belief in fate implies a passivity, in my opinion, belied by his own vigorous activity as a lawyer and a politician on the rise. It also suggests, in my mind, a deistic view of the world that contradicts Lincoln's belief that God directs the affairs of men not only through impersonal laws and forces, but also in response to their prayers and through their very actions. Throughout his political career, Lincoln made a habit of uniting a concern for his final account to God with a consideration of his duty to the American people. This was made clear in a brief address he delivered to the New Jersey Senate en route to his first inauguration as president. Lincoln highlighted the historic location of Trenton, New Jersey as a pivotal location during the American Revolutionary War. He observed that there was something special, something beyond mere national independence for which the colonists fought. He said it contained a great promise, not only to the Americans who fought for independence, but to all the people of the world, to all time to come. That promise was a form of government that would secure the liberties of the people consistent with the equality of mankind. That was its only legitimate basis. If the nation could not or would not perpetuate itself in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made, the American Union and the Constitution, in Lincoln's mind, would have been created in vain. This was a premise that Lincoln would return to most famously, of course, in his Gettysburg Address, where he called the Civil War a test whether that nation or any nation so conceived or so dedicated can long endure. The idea of constitutional self-government under the beneficence of God stands as a running theme for Lincoln. A chief example is his well-known reference to the American people as God's almost chosen people. In relating the early revolutionary efforts of New Jersey to his present objective as president-elect, Lincoln remarks, I shall be most happy indeed if I shall be an humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty, and of this, his almost chosen people, for perpetuating the object of that great struggle. Here he provides a political parallel for the biblical representative of God's will, the Hebrew nation. But where the Jews of the Old Testament were chosen by God to be a spiritual light unto the nations, Lincoln suggests that the American people could very well be God's elect to offer political light unto the world. Lincoln calls them God's almost chosen people. For in a political sense, the American people could only be God's chosen if they succeeded in perpetuating this union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people according to the original idea, liberty for all. An ideal in his mind that held out a great promise to all the people of all the world to come. But with the nation divided over slavery, Lincoln could scarcely call them God's chosen people without qualification. But Lincoln came to discover that his much vaunted devotion to the Constitution and the rule of law, even his leadership of a war effort to preserve what he considered to be the last best hope of earth, apparently fell short of the purposes of the Almighty. As he put it in his second inaugural address, his original intentions for the war, as well as those of the insurgents, would have produced, quote, an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Even presiding over a nation that read the same Bible and prayed to the same God did not ensure that the divine will would be manifest in the actions of one or the other party. Lincoln concluded, the Almighty has his own purposes. As late as September 1862, Lincoln continued to make the case for his political religion, reverence for the Constitution and laws, telling a group of ministers who had called for a national emancipation proclamation. He said, I think you should admit that we already have an important principle to rally and unite the people in the fact that constitutional government is at stake. This is a fundamental idea going down about as deep as anything. For Lincoln, the cause of constitutional government was the cause of liberty. To speak of liberty without providing for its security was utopian. Nevertheless, at the time that he met with these ministers, he had already drafted an Emancipation Proclamation and was simply waiting for an opportune time to issue it. He then gave them a subtle hint to this effect. I have not decided against a proclamation of liberty to the slaves, but hold the matter under advisement. And I can assure you that the subject is on my mind day and night more than any other. What shall appear to be God's will, I will do. 4 days later, with the Battle of Antietam's repulse of General Lee's invasion into Maryland, Lincoln saw in the Union victory a sign of God's will for the slaves. He would issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation the following week and surprise his cabinet by sharing a vow he had made to God regarding the war and emancipation. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles wrote the following in his diary. Lincoln remarked that he had made a vow, a covenant, that if God gave us the victory in the approaching battle, he would consider it an indication of divine will, and that it was his duty to move forward in the cause of emancipation. God had decided this question in favor of the slaves. Samuel Chase's diary includes a similar account of Lincoln swearing an oath to his Maker. In April 1864, Lincoln acknowledged publicly what Chase and Welles noted privately in September 1862 about his vow to God to free the slaves. In Baltimore, Maryland, Lincoln addressed the following words to a sanitary fair. He said, upon a clear conviction of duty, I resolved to turn that element of strength, the use of what was called at the time colored troops, to account. And I am responsible for it to the American people, to the Christian world, to history, and on my final account to God. Lincoln confesses that he owes a reckoning to the Almighty for the Emancipation Proclamation, which included a provision that such freed persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. What makes this all the more instructive is how Lincoln decided it was time to issue the proclamation. Not only had he sworn this vow, but he also came to believe that fighting the war merely to preserve the constitutional union was an insufficient rationale for his presidential administration. As Wells recorded it, God had decided this question in favor of the slaves.